All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are on chapter... give me a second. Hold on. Chapter 6, I believe. Yes, chapter 6 on Black-Jewish relations. We are reading Race Matters by Cornel West. This has been one of the books that I've read that has done the job of touching on the cultural dynamics that come along with racial injustice in this country, not simply just the political or economic implications that it has, even though, again, within culture is also politics and economy, and within politics and economy is also culture. And so I think that that's one of the things that, and I said this at the end of the last episode, which I sort of rushed ending that one. We had somebody stop by the occupation that I wanted to, that I need to speak to. But that is one of the things that I think I take away the most from this, is the importance of being able to add all aspects of human existence into these conversations about police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I believe Cornel West does a great job of adding the cultural aspect into it. Okay. For if there are no waving flags and marching songs at the barricades of Walt... My fault. I messed that sentence up, but I just want to make sure that the audio is... Okay. I want to make sure the mic audio is up. Okay. Let's try this again. For if there are no waving flags and marching songs at the barricades as Walter marches out with his little battalion, it is not because the battle lacks nobility. On the contrary, he has picked up in his way, still imperfect and wobbly in his small view of human destiny, what I believe Arthur Miller once called, quote, the golden thread of history, end quote. He becomes, in spite of those who are too intrigued with despair and hatred of man to see it, King Oedipius, refusing to tear out his eyes, but attacking the oracle instead. He is that last Jewish patriot manning his rifle at Warsaw. He is that young girl who swam into sharks to save a friend a few weeks ago. He is Anne Frank, still believing in people. He is the 9 small heroes of Little Rock. He is Michelangelo, creating David and Beethoven, bursting forth with the Ninth Symphony. He is all those things because he has finally reached out in his tiny moment and caught that sweet essence which is human dignity, and it shines like the old star-touched dream that is in his eyes. Lorraine Hansberry, in Author's Reflections, Walter Lee Younger, Willie Loman, and He Who Must Live, 1959. Recent debates on the state of Black-Jewish relations have generated more heat than light. Instead of critical dialogue and respectful exchange, we have witnessed several bouts of vulgar name-calling and self-righteous finger-pointing. Battles conducted on the editorial page, like the one between Henry Louis Gates Jr., the eminent Harvard professor, and John Henrik Clarke, the distinguished Pan-African scholar, in the New York Times and the City Sun, respectively, do not take us very far in understanding Black-Jewish relations. Black anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-Black racism are real, and both are as profoundly American as cherry pie. There was no golden age in which blacks and Jews were free of tension and friction. Yet there was a better age when the common histories of oppression and degradation of both groups served as a springboard for genuine empathy and principled alliances. Since the late 60s, Black-Jewish relations have reached a nadir. Why is this so? In order to account for this sad state of affairs, we must begin to unearth the truth behind each group's perceptions of the other and perceptions of itself. For example, few blacks recognize and acknowledge one fundamental fact of Jewish history. A profound hatred of Jews sits at the center of medieval and modern European cultures. Jewish persecutions under the Byzantines, Jewish massacres during the Crusades, Jewish expulsions in England 1290, France 1306, Spain 1492, Portugal 1497, Frankfurt 1614, and Vienna 1670, and Jewish pogroms in the Ukraine 1648, 1768, Odessa 1871, and throughout Russia, especially after 1881, culminating in Kishinev 1903, constitute the vast historical backdrop to current Jewish preoccupations with self-reliance and the Jewish anxiety of group death. Needless to say, the Nazi attempt at judocide in the 1930s and 1940s reinforced this preoccupation and anxiety. The European hatred of Jews rests on religious and social grounds. Christian myths of Jews as Christ killers and resentment over the disproportionate presence of Jews in certain commercial occupations. The religious bigotry feeds on stereotypes of Jews as villainous transgressors of the sacred. The social bigotry on alleged Jewish conspiratorial schemes for power and control. Ironically, the founding of the State of Israel, the triumph of the quest for modern Jewish self-determination, came about less from Jewish power and more from the consensus of the two superpowers, the United States and USSR, to secure a homeland for a despised and degraded people after Hitler's genocidal attempt. The history of Jews in America, for the most part, flies in the face of this tragic Jewish past. The majority of Jewish immigrants arrived in America around the turn of the century, 1881 to 1924. They brought a strong heritage that put a premium on what had ensured their survival and identity: institutional autonomy, rabbinical learning, and business zeal. Like other European immigrants, Jews for the most part became complicitous with the American racial caste system. Even in, quote, Christian, end quote, America, with its formidable anti-Semitic barriers, and despite a rich progressive tradition that made Jews more likely than other immigrants to feel compassion for oppressed blacks, large numbers of Jews tried to procure a foothold in America by falling in step with the widespread perpetuation of anti-black stereotypes and garnering the white-skin privilege benefits available to non-black Americans. It goes without saying that a profound hatred of African people, as seen in slavery, lynching, segregation, and second-class citizenship, sits at the center of American civilization. The period of genuine empathy and principled alliances between Jews and blacks, 1910 through 1967, constitutes a major pillar of American progressive politics in this century. These supportive links begin with W.E.B. Du Bois' The Crisis and Abraham Cahan's Jewish Daily Forward, and are seen clearly between Jewish leftists and A. Philip Randolph's numerous organizations, between Eliot Cohen's commentary and the early career of James Baldwin, between prophets like Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr., or between the Disproportionately Jewish Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Presently, this inspiring period of black-Jewish cooperation is often downplayed by blacks and romanticized by Jews. It is downplayed by blacks because they focus on the astonishingly rapid entry of most Jews into the middle and upper middle classes during this brief period. An entry that has spawned both an intense conflict with the more slowly growing black middle class and a social resentment from a quickly growing black impoverished class. Jews, on the other hand, tend to romanticize this period because their present status as upper middle dogs and some top dogs in American society unsettles their historic self-image as progressives with a compassion for the underdog. And so in that first passage, there was a reflection of the history of a small reflection of the history of Jewish people in the globally, and also a small reflection of the experiences that Jewish people have had in America, and also a small reflection on some of the relationship dynamics between Jewish people in America and black people in America. And there were a lot of dates and countries and that were brought up that I don't know the specifics of, and know a very detailed history about. That in the process of doing all these things, I hope to begin to get more of an understanding and history of, because I do believe that is something that is important. And that really brings me to my first main takeaway from this passage that we've read on Black Jewish Relations and Race Matters by Cornel West, and that is the importance of understanding the past history of other intersections and other people from other intersections, and also understanding the connectivity that you have with people from those intersections, and understanding the dynamics of past relationships that those intersections have had with each other, knowing what the past relationships have been for black people in this country with the indigenous people in this country, knowing what some of the barriers have been for black people and indigenous people, knowing what the barriers have been for Jewish people and indigenous people, or Jewish people and black people, Hispanics and black people, Middle Eastern people and black people. And the more that we know those things and understand those things, and not necessarily just trying to center our understanding only to what it is that we've experienced or that we go through, I think we get closer to being able, again, to paint that full spectrum of specifically for us here in Rockford, Illinois, police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and all the different ways that it affects people. And but it also does the job of getting us to a place of finding how to best absolve it, and getting more people involved in the struggle to absolve it by being able to point out to them how they have also been affected by these things. What up, what up, what up? How they have also been affected by these things. And so that's one of the first things that I'll take away from there. That's it. We outside. People honking the horn. Okay. All right. Next part. Let's continue to the next piece. In the present era, blacks and Jews are in contention over two major issues. The first is the question of what constitutes the most effective means for black progress in America. With over half of all black professionals and managers being employed in the public sphere, and those in the private sphere often gaining entry owing to regulatory checks by EEOC, attacks by some Jews on affirmative action are perceived as assaults on black livelihood. And since a disproportionate percentage of poor blacks depend on government support to survive, attempts to dismantle public programs are viewed by blacks as opposition to black survival. Visible Jewish resistance to affirmative action and government spending on social programs pits some Jews against black progress. This opposition, though not as strong as that of other groups in the country, is all the more visible to black people because of past Jewish support for black progress. It also seems to reek of naked group interest, as well as willingness to abandon compassion for the underdogs of American society. The second major area of contention concerns the meaning and practice of Zionism as embodied in the state of Israel. Without a sympathetic understanding of the deep historic sources of Jewish fears and anxieties about group survival, blacks will not grasp the visceral attachment of most Jews to Israel. Similarly, without a candid acknowledgement of black status as permanent underdogs in American society, Jews will not comprehend what the symbolic predicament and literal plight of Palestinians in Israel means to blacks. Jews rightly point out that the atrocities of Africa elites on oppressed Africans in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia are just as bad or worse than those perpetrated on Palestinians by Israeli elites. Some also point out, rightly, that deals and treaties between Israel and South Africa are not so radically different from those between some black African, Latin American, and Asian countries in South Africa. Still, these and other Jewish charges of black double standards with regard to Israel do not take us to the heart of the matter. Blacks often perceive the Jewish defense of the state of Israel as a second instance of naked group interest and, again, an abandonment of substantive moral deliberation. At the same time, Jews tend to view black critiques of Israel as black rejection of the Jewish right to group survival, and hence as a betrayal of the precondition for a black-Jewish alliance. What is at stake here is not simply black-Jewish relations, but, more importantly, the moral content of Jewish and black identities and of their political consequences. The ascendance of the conservative Likud Party in Israel in 1977 and the visibility of narrow black nationalist voices in the 80s helped solidify this impasse. When mainstream American Jewish organizations supported the inhumane policies of Begin and Shamir, they tipped their hats toward cold-hearted interest group calculations. When black nationalist spokesmen like Farrakhan and Jeffries excessively targeted Jewish powers as subordinating black and brown peoples, they have played the same mean-spirited game. In turning their heads from the ugly truth of Palestinian subjugation and in refusing to admit the falsity of the alleged Jewish conspiracies, both sides failed to define the moral character of their Jewish and black identities. The present impasse in black-Jewish relations will be overcome only when self-critical exchanges take place within and across black and Jewish communities, not simply about their own group interests, but also, and more importantly, about what being black or Jewish mean in ethical terms. This kind of reflection should not be so naive as to ignore group interest, but it should take us to a higher moral ground where serious discussions about democracy and justice determine how we define ourselves and our politics and help us formulate strategies and tactics to sidestep the traps of tribalism and chauvinism. The vicious murder of Yankel Rosenbaum in Crown Heights in the summer of 1991 bore chilling testimony to a growing black anti-Semitism in this country. Although this particular form of xenophobia from below does not have the same institutional power of those racisms that afflict their victims from above, it certainly deserves the same moral condemnation. Furthermore, the very ethical character of the black freedom struggle largely depends on the open condemnation by its spokespersons of any racist attitude or action. In our present moment, when a neo-Nazi like David Duke can win 55% of the white vote and 69% of the white, quote, born again, end quote, Protestant vote in Louisiana, it may seem misguided to highlight anti-Semitic behavior of black people, the exemplary targets of racial hatred in America. Yet I suggest that this focus is crucial precisely because we black folk have been in the forefront of the struggle against American racism. If these efforts fall prey to anti-Semitism, then the principled attempt to combat racism forfeits much of its moral credibility, and we all lose. To put it bluntly, if the black freedom struggle becomes simply a power-driven war of all against all that pits xenophobia from below against racism from above, then David Duke's project is the wave of the future, and a racial apocalypse awaits us. Despite Duke's resounding defeat, we witness increasing racial and sexual violence, coupled with growing economic deprivation, that together provide the raw ingredients for such a frightening future. Black people have searched desperately for allies in the struggle against racism and have found Jews to be disproportionately represented in the ranks of that struggle. The desperation that sometimes informs the anti-racist struggle arises out of two conflicting historical forces: America's historically weak will to racial justice and an all-inclusive moral vision of freedom and justice for all. Escalating, what up, y'all? Y'all stay safe out here. Stay safe out here, y'all. Escalating black anti-Semitism is a symptom of this desperation going sour. It is the bitter fruit of a profound self-destructive impulse, nurtured on the vines of hopelessness and concealed by empty gestures of black unity. The images of black activists yelling, quote, "Where's Hitler when we need him," end quote, and, quote, "Heil Hitler," end quote, juxtaposed with those of David Duke celebrating Hitler's birthday, seem to feed a single fire of intolerance burning on both ends of the American candle that threatens to consume us all. And that brings us to a stopping point here with Race Matters. And I think that at this stopping point, what I would reflect on is, or some of the things that stand out the most, is the warning that Cornel West gives. Again, it's important to remember that this specific piece of literature was written in 1990. Well, it was released in 1993. It was re-released in 2001 and then re-released again in 2017, I believe. And we are reading the 25th anniversary, the re-release in 2017. And so, in one of the three prefaces, Cornel West speaks about how many things have manifested and unfolded in American history and society, and since he first wrote this piece of literature. And as we go through and we continue to read through this literature, I think that that's one of the things that is a constant reminder, is that even though that he wrote, and this was released in 1993, and it gave warning to some of the things that would manifest in the 21st century. And one of the things that I think about when I think about David Duke and the warnings that Cornel West gave to David Duke, is I think about Donald Trump. And I think about this new form of Proud Boy, alt-right Republicans who are coming out of the woodworks, who are feeding upon hatred, who are feeding upon divisiveness, who are feeding upon dividing, who are feeding upon using misinformation as an instrument for that division, using misinformation as an instrument for misinformation as an instrument to keep people subjugated and keep people separate from each other. And I think that again, that is one of the main pieces of wisdom I'm taking away from this, and main pieces of knowledge I'm taking away from reading this portion of Race Matters, is the importance of becoming informed about people who exist in a different part of American society than you, so that way somebody can't use misinformation to manipulate you into thinking somebody who is your ally, you view them as your enemy. So that way you don't end up with the perspective of viewing somebody who is an ally as an enemy, or viewing somebody who is has the, or even just if you can, just even understanding the potential of alliances. You know, maybe there may not be allies at this moment, but there's potential to be allies based off of alliances that have been formed in the past, and based off of common interest in the present, and based off of a shared interest of the future. And so those are all things that I'm coming across as I'm reading this. Let's continue. I want to see, are we going to be able to get through this chapter? My fault. Yeah, we'll be able to get through this chapter for this episode. Black anti-Semitism rests on three basic pillars. First, it is a species... What up? First, it is a species of anti-whiteism. Jewish complicity in American... Oh, my fault, y'all. Lost my spot. Okay. Black anti-Semitism rests on three basic pillars. First, it is a species of anti-whiteism. Jewish complicity in American racism, even though it is less extensive than the complicity of other white Americans, reinforces black perceptions that Jews are identical to any other group benefiting from white skin privileges in racist America. This view denies the actual history and treatment of Jews, and the particular interactions of Jews and black people in the hierarchies of business and education cast Jews as the public face of oppression for the black community, and thus lend evidence to this mistaken view of Jews as any other white folk. Second, black anti-Semitism is a result of higher expectations some black folks have of Jews. This perspective holds Jews to a moral standard different from that extended to other white ethnic groups, principally owing to the ugly history of anti-Semitism in the world, especially in Europe and the Middle East. Such double standards assume that Jews and blacks are, quote, natural, end quote, allies, since both groups have suffered chronic degradation and oppression at the hands of racial and ethnic majorities. So when Jewish neoconservatism gains a high public profile at a time when black people are more and more vulnerable, the charge of, quote, betrayal, end quote, surfaces among black folk who feel let down. Such utterances resonate strongly in a black Protestant culture that has inherited many stock Christian anti-Semitic narratives of Jews as Christ killers. These infamous narratives historically have had less weight in the black community, in stark contrast to the more obdurate white Christian varieties of anti-Semitism. Yet in moments of desperation in the black community, they tend to reemerge, charged with the rhetoric of Jewish betrayal. Third, black anti-Semitism is a form of underdog resentment and envy directed at another underdog who has, quote, made it, end quote, in American society. The remarkable upward mobility of American Jews, rooted chiefly in a history and culture that places a premium on higher education and self-organization, easily lends itself to myths of Jewish unity and homogeneity that have gained currency among other groups, especially among relatively unorganized groups like Black Americans. The high visibility of Jews in the upper reaches of the academy, journalism, the entertainment industry, and the professions, though less so percentage-wise in corporate America and national political office, is viewed less as a result of hard work and success fairly won, and more as a matter of favoritism and nepotism among Jews. Ironically, calls for Black solidarity and achievement are often modeled on myths of Jewish unity, as both groups respond to American xenophobia and racism. But in times such as these, some Blacks view Jews as obstacles rather than allies in the struggle for racial justice. These three elements of Black anti-Semitism, which also characterize the outlooks of some other ethnic groups in America, have a long history among Black people. Yet the recent upsurge of Black anti-Semitism exploits two other prominent features of the political landscape identified with the American Jewish establishment: the military status of Israel in the Middle East, especially in its enforcement of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and the visible conservative Jewish opposition to what is perceived to be a major means of Black progress, namely affirmative action. Of course, principal critiques of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, of Israeli denigration of Palestinians, or attacks on affirmative action transcend anti-Semitic sensibilities. Yet vulgar critiques do not, and often are shot through with such sensibilities in white and Black America alike. These vulgar critiques, usually based on sheer ignorance and a misinformed thirst for vengeance, add an aggressive edge to Black anti-Semitism. And in the rhetoric of a Louis Farrakhan or a Leonard Jeffries, whose audiences rightly hunger for Black self-respect and oppose Black degradation, these critiques misdirect progressive Black energies arrayed against unaccountable corporate power and anti-Black racism, steering them instead toward Jewish elites and anti-Black conspiracies in Jewish America. This displacement is disturbing not only because it is analytically and morally wrong, it also discourages any effective alliances across races. The rhetoric of Farrakhan and Jeffries feeds on the undeniable history of Black denigration at the hands of Americans of every ethnic and religious group. The delicate issues of Black self-love and Black self-contempt are then viewed in terms of white put-down and Jewish conspiracy. The precious quest for Black self-esteem is reduced to immature and cathartic gestures that bespeak an excessive obsession with whites and Jews. There can be no healthy conception of Black humanity based on such obsessions. The best of Black culture, as manifested, for example, in jazz or the prophetic Black church, refuses to put whites or Jews on a pedestal or in the gutter. Rather, Black humanity is affirmed alongside that of others, even when those of others have at times dehumanized Blacks. To put it bluntly, when Black humanity is taken for granted and not made to prove itself in white culture, whites, Jews, and others are not that important. They are simply human beings, just like Black people. If the best of Black culture wanes in the face of Black anti-Semitism, Black people will become even more isolated as a community, and the Black freedom struggle will be tarred with the brush of immorality. For example, most Americans wrongly believe that the Black community has been silent in the face of Yankel Rosenbaum's murder. This perception exists because the moral voices in Black America have been either ignored or drowned out by the more sensationalist and xenophobic ones. The major New York City newspapers and periodicals seem to have little interest in making known to the public the moral condemnations voiced by Reverend Gary Simpson of Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn, with 10,000 Black members, Reverend James Forbes of Riverside Church, with 3,000 Black members, Reverend Carolyn Knight of Philadelphia Baptist Church in Harlem, Reverend Susan Johnson of Mariners Baptist Church in Manhattan, Reverend Mark Taylor of the Church of the Open Door in Brooklyn, Reverend Victor Hall of Calvary Baptist Church in Queens, and many more. Black anti-Semitism is not caused by media hype, yet it does sell more newspapers and turn our attention away from those Black prophetic energies that give us some hope. My fundamental premise is that the black freedom struggle is the major buffer between the David Dukes of America and the hope for a future in which we can begin to take justice and freedom for all seriously. Black anti-Semitism, along with its concomitant xenophobia, such as patriarchal and homophobic prejudices, weakens this buffer. In the process, it plays into the hands of the old-style racists who appeal to the worst of our fellow citizens amid the silent depression that plagues the majority of Americans. Without some redistribution of wealth and power, downward mobility and debilitating poverty will continue to drive people into desperate channels. And without principled opposition to xenophobias from above and below, these desperate channels will produce a cold-hearted and mean-spirited America no longer worth fighting for or living in. And that brings us to the end of chapter, I believe it was just the 6th chapter, the end of chapter 6 on race matters. Again, this chapter was entitled on Black-Jewish relations. And I think in that last section that we read through, the first thing I want to take the time to point out, give me 1 second here, is, 1 second, Jewish elites, white self. Okay, this sentence right here. The delicate issues of black self-love and black self-contempt are then viewed in terms of white put-down and Jewish conspiracy. The precious quest for black self-esteem is reduced to immature and cathartic gestures that bespeak an excessive obsession with whites and Jews. And I think that that's one of the things, again, when we speak about the specifics of this piece of literature that Cornel West has written. That's one of the things that separates this from some of the other pieces that we've read through, or some of the other things that have been written by other people. The emphasis that he puts on culture, the emphasis that he puts on community, the emphasis he puts on the society, as opposed to some other people who have put that same emphasis on policy and law and legislation. And that is something that and part of that has been his conversation about black self-love and black self-contempt and the thin line between those two things. And he has, in this specific chapter, used how people people have had anti-Semitic statements or have been or people who have maybe been accused of anti-Semitic ideologies, how he believes that the over focus on Jewish community or over focus on any other community can do the danger of feeding too much into black self-contempt. He talks about how a lot of times people speak about how black people need to be organized more like Jewish people are organized. And he says that though there is some truth in the fact that black people need to be more organized, it doesn't need to hinder on being more organized like how Jewish people are organized. And I think that that's something that is true as well. That's one of the things that I also myself personally believe is that sometimes in the process of talking about things that we need to do better as a community of black people, it doesn't need to be compared to what the Italian community is doing or what the Irish community is doing, because that does do the job of putting them on a pedestal or putting these other communities on a pedestal. And I think that one of the other things that has to always be remembered is that what black people deal with in this society and in this country is completely different than what any other group has dealt with or what any other group will deal with. And so there will never be any way for us to properly compare where we are at currently with where another group is at, or compare the way that we struggle with the way another group struggles. But I do think that, again, one of the things that he talks about that is important is building that understanding of what Jewish people have been through in America. So that way, when it's time to build alliances, when it's time to have organization within groups and communities, you can understand the things that a certain community has been through before. So that way you can build those bridges and alliances and work together and know how to work together. But also so that way you can't be played against another community. When you understand the history of what Jewish people have went through in America, along with understanding the history of what you have went through as a black person in America, it makes it so that a white person who is neither Jewish nor black can't play you against the Jewish community or play the Jewish community against the black community. And you can understand the commonalities that you have and things that you need moving forward, and also the things that may differ in the communities that you need to be able to have open dialogue and converse about. And again, this is one of the things that Cornel West speaks about, is how this can be applied to any other community. This can be applied to the Mexican community, to the Puerto Rican community, to the Cuban community, to the Middle Eastern community, to African immigrants who come over here from other places. Is that once you enter into American society, if you are not a white, straight male, you are in a marginalized group. You are going to be in a subjugated group. Now, the manner of that marginalization will be different depending on how much money you may have. The manner of that marginalization will be different based on the color of your skin, or the if you are white passing or not. The manner of that will be different based on your religious belief. The manner of that will be different based on your class that you have in the society. But if you are not in what is deemed to be the mainstream of American society, where the group that you come from has historical precedents of oppression and exploitation and injustice in this society, and you any generations that may come forward run the risk of that same type of oppression, exploitation, and degradation coming down upon them. And so we need to all do the job of strengthening our communities, of strengthening our collectives. But part of that strengthening is being informed about other communities, being informed about other collectives, so that way we can get to a place of combating all of these issues. And again, for what we're out here doing, primarily the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And so that will bring us to the end of this episode of Rockford Reading Daily. We'll be back with the next episode tomorrow for Rockford Reading Daily, and we'll start on, I think we're on chapter 7. We'll start on chapter 7, Black Sexuality, the Taboo Subject. Again, we're reading Race Matters by Cornel West. This is the 25th anniversary edition. Want to ask you to share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow on Twitter, like us on Instagram, subscribe on YouTube. And again, we do these Rockford Reading Daily episodes to present people the opportunity every day to begin on their journey to struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and to also present people every day an opportunity to further on their journey to struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. So again, go ahead, share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and we'll be back tomorrow. All right, we outside.